As I have pointed out on a number of occasions over the past 3 years, there can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people. That is why I have undertaken initiatives in several areas to open the door for more normal relations between our two countries.
Diversifying, not decoupling.
You say that the decoupling is dangerous or risky, but it's underway.
If you were president, would you make China pay? And please be specific, what would that look like?
What I'd make China do is play by the international rules.
I think because we've got a decoupling that is absolutely going to happen.
You have said that we need to see a decoupling from China and regimes that don't share our values.
U.S. lawmakers pushing to decouple from China. That call part of efforts to counter the Chinese Communist Party.
The United States should not decouple. Washington is in the grips of an ideology of decoupling from China. The People's Republic of China. They're using American news media to convince us not to trust China anymore. Don't believe it. From 1972 until early in the 21st century, U.S. foreign relations and trade embraced inclusion, sharing, and exchange with China. But we are now being pulled in reverse. This is not a grassroots effort. That's why I said it was Washington. The powers that be in Washington are conditioning the American people to support decoupling from China. Washington is telling us that China is growing in power and is a direct threat to American interests. Who in Washington believes this? Biden, Trump, Obama. Both political parties, the military establishment, the think tanks, and the mainstream news media. According to this thinking, the United States is a force for good in the world, and still the world's one superpower. China, on the other hand, is attempting to take America's place as the dominant power. And China is an authoritarian regime. Who doesn't buy this new narrative of a dangerous China trying to supplant the United States? Wall Street, corporate America. In short, American business is global, is objective, not ideological. It follows the money and sees the world through the lens of markets. And the market has been working. Wall Street does not want to go to war with China, not militarily, but also not economically. As far as American business is concerned, President Richard Nixon was right in 1972 when he opened relations with the world's most populous country. The United States has everything to gain from staying coupled with China, as does the world. For the time being, Wall Street is not being listened to, as the new narrative is being pushed through the corridors of influence and power in Washington and spread out in nightly news reports and the daily press with bad things about China. Wall Street is commonly deferred to when our country's economic interests are concerned, but not this time. American business is talking China, but it's just a cry from the back of the room. But make no mistake, decoupling will be a disaster for the United States and for the world. Look what's already happened. We can't reach vital environmental accords with China because of decoupling. The U.S. anti-China sanctions have already contributed to inflation. Taiwan's independence is at greater risk. In 1972, Nixon and Kissinger reoriented U.S. policy toward the People's Republic of China. We began to establish trade relations. Both men, President Nixon and his advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, had been hawkish toward China for years, but times were a-changin'. it no longer made sense to isolate the most populous country in the world. Nixon and Kissinger believed that the Chinese economy would gradually grow, and when it did, the U.S. would be ready to do business. The Nixon administration also believed that an isolated China would likely feel it necessary to collaborate with an isolated Soviet Union, so that the U.S. would find itself on the opposite side of a large, well-armed team. If the U.S. could get on the friendly basis with China, China would feel no need to team up with Russia against the United States. But Nixon's opening to China also put pressure on the Soviet Union to reduce its belligerence, because now Russia was looking at a team of the U.S. and China. Since all three, the U.S., China, and the Soviet Union, were armed with nuclear weapons, a strategy that reduced threats in all directions was obviously a good thing. From 1972 through the year 2000, the evidence that Nixon and Kissinger had judged the geopolitics correctly looked indisputable. Henry Kissinger, 99 years old in 2023, insists that reversing back to suspicion and confrontation with China after 50 years of relations would be a serious mistake. Kissinger says, starting with Richard Nixon, 7 presidents have affirmed the importance of cooperative relations with China. Said Kissinger, recently we have new voices in Washington implying that we've got China on some sort of probation. The fact is, says Kissinger, Asia is rising, China is rising, and this will mean a reordering of the international system. Kissinger says, if you think the communist China of 1972 is the same as today, the economic system proves you wrong. As young men, neither Nixon nor Kissinger was pro-China, and both might be called personally ideological.
We know what peace demands. We will keep America the strongest nation in the world, and we will couple that strength with firm diplomacy. No apologies, no regrets. Always willing to negotiate for peace, but never conceding anything without getting a concession in return.
But as government leaders, as statesmen, they didn't think ideologically, but strategically. And that was the difference. Today's U.S. foreign policy is dominated by people with ideological interests, and that's why it fails over and over again, and where Nixon's succeeded. But where did the decoupling campaign originate? The crusade against China originated in a nexus of political and intellectual interests in Washington's influential think tanks. The think tanks are Washington organizations that begin with zero political legitimacy, which is to say, nobody voted for the members, but they have financial backing and clusters of well-connected semi-scholars formulating worldviews that eventually drive public policy. The politicians pick up their arguments, and many think tank experts worm their way in high positions in the government. From the moment the Soviet Union broke into pieces in 1990-91, the anti-China neocons wanted Washington to focus on China as the threat. Neocons were not pleased with President Bill Clinton's advocacy of Chinese entrance into the World Trade Organization. Clinton needed China in because Clinton needed to deliver affordable consumer goods to Americans to make up for another U.S. need that he couldn't fix. Not during Clinton's presidency, nor in 2023, Has America been able to produce the new jobs with good pay for its large working class? Low-price imports from China have let Washington politicians off the hook for a while, as this country continues to lack a manufacturing and industrial base. But inexpensive goods are not a priority for China hawks. The neocons have rewritten the story of the abandonment of U.S. industry, and it was China's fault, something China did to America. But China never stole American jobs. American companies sought out China, aided by American politicians. U.S. business did not want to pay American wages and American benefits. Chinese industry took what American elites brought to it. What has propelled the rise of the anti-China hawks over the past decade? To put it short, Chinese economic growth, which has been strong at a time when America's was shaky. In the aftermath of the 2008 home mortgage crisis, for the first time, there was fear in Washington that the U.S. was being surpassed as the world's most powerful and rich country. It was not happening on a battlefield, it was happening in the marketplace. Who wrote the origin story to the decouple from China narrative? Let's start in 1997 with the Project for the New American Century, a think tank guided by Robert Kagan, a well-connected ideologue who promoted the idea that this was the moment for the U.S. to solidify its position of unchallenged leadership in the world. Unipolar.
The United States needs to firmly but patiently contain China with a careful blend of deterrence, reassurance, and damage limitation. These moves won't eliminate the root causes of U.S.-China rivalry, but they would protect U.S. interests while avoiding a slide to a cold or hot war.
Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, is also a neocon who first was appointed to the State Department under Bill Clinton back in the 1990s. This is a neocon power couple who, 20 years later, still move in the corridors of influence, still arguing for an America that does not accept competitors. There are other neoconservative think tanks with the anti-China message: the Council on Foreign Relations, the Rand Corporation, the Hoover Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Hudson Institute. The message they deliver: don't buy or sell with China. Challenge China with a naval presence in the South China Sea. Plan ahead for war with China.
Well, the only country that's provocative in the region today is China.
And the best way of summing this up is vote default, vote Beijing.
It's really that we don't trust China, you know.
They're more self-confident, they're more assertive, they want other countries to pay more respect for their interests as defined by themselves, and they have a tendency to want to throw their weight around. The Chinese are showing those characteristics.
China and Russia are waging sophisticated and well-resourced global campaigns to discredit and subvert democracy.
China interprets us going almost on hands and knees, asking for summits, as a sign of our weakness and their strength.
There's a reason we're doing this. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't represent the Chinese people. It's that simple.
It is a given within neoconservative thinking that the U.S. is invariably right and invariably necessary, while other countries are less right and less necessary. One of the weaknesses to crafting foreign policy from this ideological perspective is the assumption that Americans have greater intelligence and greater personal character than others, especially when put in contrast to those who neocons call America's adversaries. And neocons always look for adversaries. (1962), President Kennedy always asked himself and asked his belligerent generals, what would we do in response if the enemy country did this to us? The generals hated this kind of question. The answer was always that the United States would never accept this humiliation or that encroachment on our rights or our territory. And Kennedy did not have to respond to that, but he knew if we would not accept an infringement, a humiliation, how could we think that an adversary would? Most of the men around Kennedy assumed that while the American will, the American dignity stood tall, the enemy's will and dignity existed on some lower, weaker level. Well, this is the kind of ideology that has moved from the margins to the center in Washington thinking today. China's will and China's sense of its own dignity is not less or lower than the United States. The PRC is not going to be outwitted, and any insult that the Americans would react to if it were done to them, China will react to as well.
也绝不允许任何外来势力欺负、压迫、奴役我们。
After George Bush and his 8 years of war on terror, Barack Obama came into office ready to make the Asia pivot that neoconservatives had wanted since 1997. Bill Clinton, before Bush, had championed trade relations with China. But by 2008, Hillary Clinton had transformed into an anti-China hawk, and Obama made her his Secretary of State. Bob Kagan's wife, Vicki Nuland, worked at State under Hillary. Kagan and Nuland of the Project for a New American Century. Obama's top Asian policy advisor was Evan Medeiros, a China specialist from the Rand Corporation, who argued that from now on, when it came to China, U.S. security policies outweighed economic policies. Months earlier, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had been a candidate against Obama in the primaries, and at that time, her leading Asia expert, Dr. Richard Baum, had quit her campaign. Baum opposed Hillary's anti-China rhetoric. Baum had been one of the insiders in the Bill Clinton administration a decade before. But there was no longer any room for an Asia expert who didn't see China as a great threat. Obama, as senator, did not stand out as anti-China, but as president, he surrounded himself with established China hawks. Obama's Asia team all regarded China as a threat to America's position in the world. And what was that position? That America should be alone at the top. For its part, the People's Republic of China immediately believed that when Obama began saying, Asia pivot, he meant that Washington wanted to put a fence around China. In one of his first Asia pivot actions, Obama met with the Burmese dictator Thein Sein and restored U.S. friendship with Burma, or called Myanmar. Had Burma become more acceptable in human rights by this point? No, but the objective was to line up opponents of China, no matter how undesirable they were. Burma, feeling emboldened by an endorsement from Obama, before long launched a genocidal campaign against Burmese Muslims that continues to this day. Obama then visited America's old communist enemy, Vietnam, and promoted military ties between Vietnam and the U.S. The fact that Obama now saw Vietnam as a potential ally proves that for all the talk, it's not really communism that the U.S. opposes, it's communists who won't accept American rules and terms when America wants them.
Vietnam very much appreciates the U.S. decision to completely lift the ban on lethal weapon sales to Vietnam.
Obama attempted to slide the U.S. into a trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. The TPP was going to be the key economic pillar of Obama's Asia pivot. It was the classic neocon anti-China trade relationship. A range of small Pacific countries were welcomed, like Brunei and Chile and Peru, along with heavyweights like Singapore and Japan, but not China. Obama would say later that during these years he needed to put up with the U.S.-China trade imbalance and to keep buying cheap goods from China because of the desperate state of the U.S. economy. There's some gratitude for you. At the same time that Obama is publicly cutting China out of a new trade partnership in its own ocean, he's counting on bargains from China so that the American people won't blame the recession on his presidency. Not surprisingly, the Chinese felt like they had become nothing more than a temporary service for the U.S. to be pushed aside once the American recession was over. What would have made the Trans-Pacific Partnership successful? If the U.S. had had the vision to invite the PRC into the creation process at the start, and not after the U.S. had already written the rules. That is, China should have been at the table when TPP trade rules were being discussed. Yes, that would have meant compromises on some of the points, on tariffs, on workers' rights, on environmental requirements. China would have undoubtedly won concessions on some requirements that mattered to it. But the U.S. would also have forced China to give in on some other points. The problem was that the U.S. wanted no compromises. It wanted a trade deal exclusively on its own terms.
The Obama administration says the trade deal will boost U.S. exports, but the deal will also allow American corporations to outsource even more jobs abroad. In other words, it's a Trojan horse in a global race to the bottom, giving big corporations from Wall Street banks a way to eliminate laws and regulations that get in the way of their profits.
TPP essentially grants corporate interest veto power over sovereign nations' domestic economic policy. So is the TPP really just about mapping out trade and tariff rules to promote economic growth for all participating nations? Or is it more about pushing this pro-corporate restriction backed by the United States onto all nations surrounding China in an effort to force the Chinese hand into abiding by U.S. standards?
Even Washington politicians distrusted the deal, and they left Obama empty-handed after 8 years of effort. So the larger point is that over 8 years of the presidency of Barack Obama, U.S. relations in Asian countries expanded only slightly beyond a familiar American fallback of Navy patrols and military bases. In 2013, President Xi launched projects aimed at boosting economic connectivity across continents by land and by sea, known collectively as the Belt and Road Initiative. Under the initiative, PRC loans billions of dollars for things like transportation and energy and commercial infrastructure in dozens of countries. By 2019, most of the Pacific countries toward which the U.S. had tried to pivot had gotten sizable loans from China under Belt and Road. And what was the U.S. doing with its money while China was funding Belt and Road construction around the world? The U.S. was bailing out U.S. banks after the crash. And then it was injecting $6 trillion more into those same banks, trying to revive the U.S. economy. While it's too soon to give a verdict on the success of the Belt and Road Initiative, it's not too soon to look at China and to look at the United States and judge their different approaches to the economic challenges of the previous decade, the post-2008 economic crash years from 2009 through 2019. Now, China didn't own any of the American home mortgage bonds that brought down the economies in several European countries, but China had not been nearly as rich as the U.S. to begin with. Even as the U.S. launched its Asia pivot, what was the American approach to its own economic growth from 2009 to 2019? I would argue that this was 10 years unmatched in U.S. history for their waste of opportunity and of money. A decade wasted. When the U.S. went into recession, the Federal Reserve strategy was to inject great sums of cash into several big banks in order to get them loaning money again. Trillions of dollars. Where did the money go? Much of it helped already rich American companies to raise their stock valuations without producing or improving anything. And this money, plus zero interest rates, meant billions of dollars went into a range of costly, speculative investment projects of dubious value to the U.S. economy. In 2008, the U.S. exported $1.8 trillion worth of goods, which was the best in the world. In 2022, that export number had moved up to $2.5 trillion worth of goods. But in 2022, we weren't number one anymore. China? In 2008, China exported $1.6 trillion worth of goods, just a hair less than the United States. By 2022, China was exporting $3.6 trillion worth. In 14 years, while the U.S. was spinning its wheels and dropping helicopters of money onto banks, China had built a $1 trillion lead in exports. If we start with the end of 2008 and into the Obama presidency, factor in 4 years of Donald Trump, and then the first 2 years of Joe Biden, that's 3 presidents getting policy guidance from multiple offices in government over more than 14 years. What useful economic strategy or planning has come out of the White House or Washington over those very important years? The Huawei Crusade. In 2010, Huawei was still a small producer of electronics equipment, but its products were becoming popular outside of China because of impressive performance and competitive pricing. We learned from top-secret WikiLeaks documents that in 2010, one of America's spy organizations, the National Security Agency, broke into Huawei's server in an operation called Shot Giant. But NSA recognized that, quote, many of our targets communicate over Huawei-produced products. And the U.S. does not like people communicating through devices it can't break into. And the U.S. saw that the global spread of Huawei communications equipment could radically reduce the U.S. spying capabilities. Washington became increasingly concerned that Huawei and China were growing in telecommunications globally and in the U.S. Washington's second concern was the phenomenal growth of Huawei in the marketplace. Huawei products, in particular its phones, were rivaling Apple's iPhones, helping Huawei become both an economic giant and a global star in technology. By 2013, the Obama administration and Washington officials were criticizing Huawei publicly for such things as stealing intellectual property from U.S. companies. To put this matter into some context, from the moment that Apple released its first iPhones, lawsuits and countersuits for idea theft and patent violation have flown back and forth in multiple countries, with the original tech thief supposedly South Korea's Samsung. Apple has sued Samsung in a dozen countries for producing a phone that looks and acts like an iPhone. A decade later, the world's customers still buy iPhones and still buy Samsung Galaxies, and Apple continues to conduct business with Samsung, one of its parts suppliers.
Good artists copy, great artists steal. And we have, always been shameless about stealing great ideas.
U.S. politicians and neocons don't complain about South Korean technology theft. The difference is that South Korea is already under the U.S. sphere of control. Because China is independent of the U.S. and rivals the U.S. in multiple ways, Washington decided to generate a narrative in which Huawei was uniquely nefarious in its behavior and its intentions. This is not only dishonest on Washington's part, it's anti-free market and anti-innovation. Samsung was able to put pressure on Apple for a time because the Galaxy phone was as good as the iPhone, but slightly less expensive. This made Apple cautious about its pricing, which benefited the consumer. Then Huawei phones rose in popularity in 2017. Huawei's were priced lower than either iPhones or Galaxies. But in 2018, the US government blocked Huawei sales in the US, so neither Apple nor Samsung felt any pressure to lower prices or to improve their products to compete with Huawei. The consumer is the loser, as is the free market. But back to 2013. The Obama administration was just beginning to grasp that the more harm you could inflict on Huawei's image and success, the more harm was being done to China. This is a philosophy rooted in insecurity rather than confidence. Back in 1961, President John Kennedy wanted the United States to get to the moon before the Russians did. He did not accomplish this goal by sabotaging Russian rockets. Kennedy funded the NASA program for a mission to the moon. But with China after 2010, the US behaved as if it were running a race heading down the track and seeing a competitor pull up alongside, reaching out to trip him. If you surpass somebody in the marketplace, that's just good business, competition at its best. Apple and Samsung are rivals, but to this day, Apple does business with Samsung because the two companies compete with their products. By going after Huawei and trying to discredit its name, the result has been immediately bad will between China and the US, which will manifest in a range of different ways that have nothing to do with smartphones. It also creates the impression that the US is not confident that it can compete with Huawei fairly, so it has to resort to dirty tricks. As it turns out, Washington's efforts against Huawei were only getting started. The Meng Wanzhou case. Counterintelligence agents and federal prosecutors began exploring possible cases against Huawei's leadership in 2010. Huawei was apparently selling mobile phone equipment to the country of Iran through a subsidiary called Skycom. This business relationship, the U.S. believed, defied trade sanctions the U.S. had unilaterally imposed on Iran. Iran getting phones was not going to endanger the world. But the US hates when somebody defies its sanctions. Huawei had offices in the United States, and it was a client to HSBC, a British bank in Hong Kong that has a headquarters in New York City. HSBC was already facing huge fines with the U.S. Department of Justice for laundering money from Mexican narco traffickers and other international entities. At some point, the Justice Department came up with a deal to let HSBC off the hook. They wanted evidence from HSBC files that would help it nail Huawei. HSBC officials walked away from that meeting having gotten the information that the Obama DOJ could use in the form of a 16-slide PowerPoint. It was a dirty business that HSBC was trying to catch one of its own clients in a legal slip-up. The risk officers at the bank should be telling Huawei if they detected the possibility of a sanctions violation, not the other way around. For the next 5 years, the Department of Justice sat on the evidence. Donald Trump was elected president in 2016. Trump's ambition originally was to get a favorable trade deal with China. But over his first year, he believed China was unresponsive, and Trump grew impatient. Meanwhile, anti-China hawks in Washington pushed Trump to get tougher. And there was one additional development in China's global business growth that was not part of the picture in 2013 when Obama had been in office. And that was the emergence of 5G networking and Huawei's increasing dominance in this global enterprise. Huawei was ahead of everybody, and it had the technology. It had the towers. It had the phones. It had the technicians. Trump was informed that if the U.S. did nothing, Huawei would reach total domination among the world's 5G providers. Rather than prosecute HSBC for the actual violation of U.S. sanctions, it was HSBC Hong Kong that had wired the payments in Huawei's Iran transaction through a New York branch. The DOJ elected to treat HSBC as the victim and Huawei as the sanction violator. This led to the next peculiarity of the Justice Department's case. It was not directed against Huawei Company, but against the chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou. There was no precedent for singling out a company executive for the misdeeds committed by the company. For example, in 2008, the DOJ fined the U.S. company Halliburton $200 million for bribing officials in Nigeria in order to secure construction contracts. A fairly egregious offense, and far worse than wiring payments through a bank in violation of a sanction. The 2008 DOJ suit was aimed at Halliburton Company, not at the president of the company, not at the chief financial officer. That was how it was done. By targeting Meng Wanzhou, the DOJ was playing a very particular game. She was not only CFO, she was the daughter of Huawei's founder and CEO.
So you're saying no one at Huawei had any idea that there was an arrest warrant out for Meng Wanzhou?
不知道，任何人都不知道。
No one in Huawei.
知道我们还会去傻的去撞这个墙。
Well, this was my question as well, because every country on that trip that she planned to go to, Argentina, Mexico, Costa Rica, France, every one of them has an extradition treaty with the U.S.
但是怎么就是像有些国家就很聪明，他们比如说他们就拒绝了美国的这个建议，怎么加拿大就不够聪明就去执行了美国这个决议呢？
What would the smart move have been?
其实就不应该去管这个事，因为这是美国的事，必须美国自己管。这样你们一管呢，就是你们也受害了，受挫折了，我们也受挫，对吧？我们认为呢，我们相信加拿大的法律，也相信美国的法律，我们是没有罪的，孟晚舟是没有罪的。
When in December she boarded a plane from Hong Kong with a stopover in Vancouver, U.S. agents knew it, and very quickly the Trump DOJ issued a request to Canada to seize Meng from the airport for extradition to the U.S. Canada did. In Washington, the Trump DOJ staged a press conference in which Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker crowded in between 10 other DOJ officials, stood at the lectern, and announced that Meng Wanzhou faced, quote, serious charges of bank fraud involving millions of dollars, and if convicted, could receive substantial jail time. With this, Huawei and China finally understood the lengths that the U.S. and the Trump administration would go in their efforts to undermine China. The U.S. wanted to take the battle beyond governments, beyond even the playing field of business, and to make it personal. They grabbed Meng Wanzhou in order to hurt and demoralize Huawei leader Ren Zhengfei, to break his spirit. The message was, challenge the U.S. and you might pay a very steep price. As it so happened, on the same day that Meng Wanzhou was hustled out of the airport and into police custody, President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China were together in Buenos Aires on the final day of the G20 summit. The two leaders had gotten on cordially and reached a ceasefire in the trade war driven by tariffs. China had pledged to buy a very substantial quantity of U.S. agricultural, industrial, and energy products to narrow the large trade deficit between the two countries. As the story was reported later, around the same hour that Trump and President Xi relaxed and dined together with the other heads of state, Meng Wanzhou was being questioned by Canadian authorities. Imagine if an American female corporate executive had been in an airport in Hong Kong during a stopover, and Chinese officials had requested she be taken for some obscure corporate crime involving bank transfers. Say that female was Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook. What could we have reliably predicted the American response to be? We wouldn't be inclined to believe any accusations against the American female CFO, and the action of China having taken her would be seen as extreme and intolerable. Yet very few Americans question any of the charges against Meng Wanzhou. Just 1 year earlier, in 2017, 3 UCLA basketball players on a goodwill visit to Hangzhou, China, had gotten themselves arrested for shoplifting expensive goods in 3 different Hangzhou stores. The proof was on security camera tape. Extensive U.S. coverage of the episode leaned heavily on the importance of getting the boys back to America. 3 days after the incident, Chinese President Xi personally intervened after a call from President Trump, and the basketball players left China unpunished. Perhaps a year later, when the individual who was in custody was Chinese, President Xi was thinking Trump owed him one. When it was American basketball player shoplifters, Trump had appealed to Xi on the basis of the humane, not the ideological, not the legal, not even the strategic. And that had been enough. But so many entities in Washington, including the press, had gotten so invested in an ideological struggle with China that the humane could play no role. Once the U.S. narrative exploded ideologically, no voice from the American side came forth to question whether Canada and the U.S. were doing the right thing to this woman. In November of 2020, Biden defeated Trump for the presidency. Meng Wanzhou had been held in Vancouver wearing an ankle monitor for 2 years. That same month, Jeffrey Bader, who had been one of Obama's Asia policy advisors, said in a video talk at Harvard that he believed Biden would bring back engagement with China rather than confrontation. Bader said, "You can't cooperate with another world leader on half of your issues while simultaneously trying to subvert that leader's country on the other half." Biden, however, was not going to engage China the way Bader had hoped. By January of 2021, Biden was preparing for his new administration, and the Department of Justice was urged to try to find a satisfactory conclusion to the Meng Wanzhou case. Justice was reluctant to give in and wanted to try offering Meng her release if she would admit her guilt. Biden did not object to this proposal. Meng and her lawyers refused. She wanted to go home, but not in exchange for a guilty plea. Once Meng refused, Biden could have told his DOJ that they gave it a shot, but that it was time to pull the case so that he could initiate a reset with China. Biden did not. If Meng wouldn't admit guilt, Biden's DOJ wanted to fight the case on through the spring and the summer, win the extradition, and bring the Huawei executive to the United States for trial. Biden agreed. The implications of Biden's choice were considerable, because once Biden was inaugurated, if he had quickly granted Meng's freedom, it would signal China that Trump had been the problem, rather than U.S. policy.
Let's say China. 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 China.
And this would have allowed Biden to engage President Xi on fresh ground. That might have helped the U.S. negotiate with China over trade, over Taiwan, over climate change, across the 4 years of Biden's terms. But by sticking to the extradition, Biden took ownership of Trump's anti-China approach. So from the first days of the Biden administration, our relationship with President Xi was poisoned. Nothing between China and the U.S. was going to go as well as it might have. By July, Meng's lawyers were finally able to get their hands on requested documentation from HSBC that showed that the bank leadership knew from the start of Huawei's relationship with the smaller subsidiary Skycom. In what should have been a red flag to the Canadian court, the US DOJ had fought Meng's request for HSBC records all along. If DOJ had the goods on Meng, why shield the documents? A curious thing happened after that point. The next time they went into the courtroom, the Canadian judge's questions to the Canadian Attorney General betrayed skepticism over the logic of their entire case. On August 12, 2021, during the extradition hearing, Judge Heather Holmes asked Attorney General Frater how could he claim that Meng Wanzhou obscured the relationship between Huawei and Skycom, while she also was assuring the bank that there was no risk that Skycom was violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. The only way Meng could have offered such assurances to HSBC was if Huawei was the boss over Skycom. Then Judge Holmes went on. Meng never denied doing business with Iran, which Huawei and HSBC both knew was under U.S. sanctions. Then the judge asked, why would it be Meng's responsibility to advise HSBC in Hong Kong not to wire money through a U.S. branch, which would constitute the sanction violation? Attorney General Frater tried to answer, but Judge Holmes brushed off his responses. The judge finally said, isn't it unusual that one would see a fraud case with no actual harm, many years after the fact, and one in which the alleged victim, HSBC, appears to have numerous employees who had all the facts that you now say Meng tried to hide? Judge Holmes seemed to be doing the defense's work for it, and with great effect. By the end of that day's hearings, the Canadian and American case was in a shambles, and it looked like the extradition case was going to be denied. The Justice Department, the FBI, and the CIA had worked for more than 8 years to build a case against the CFO of Huawei, and now DOJ did not want to face the humiliation of having Canada refuse the extradition in front of the whole world.
The breaking news in the story and legal saga of Meng Wanzhou, due back in court in British Columbia on Monday, as a matter of fact. But the breaking news, as reported both in the Wall Street Journal and by Reuters yesterday, that lawyers for Meng Wanzhou and lawyers for the U.S. Department of Justice are in talks, in negotiations, to work out a deal that would see her no longer face extradition, that would see her be able to return to China.
What do you make of this report?
Well, if it's confirmed, this would be great news, because I think that everyone in Ottawa was waiting for a miracle that would come from Washington. So
the Justice Department convinced the American press that it would now withdraw all of the charges against Meng in the interest of goodwill toward China. This was lies, but American media believed every word. If the American president had wanted goodwill toward China, he could have freed Meng back in January when he first came into office. Biden's people had waited to see how the final extradition hearing went. They did not drop the charges until it was clear that they were going to lose in court.
A Chinese tech executive released after being detained in Canada for nearly 3 years returned home today.
I spoke before about the absence of the humane in this international dispute. Now to the strategic. I go back to President Kennedy's very tense dealing with the Soviet Union over the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, because Kennedy had also been surrounded by ideologues who wanted to punish Russia, but Kennedy himself tried to be strategic. The military leaders called for an immediate airstrike to wipe out all of the Russian missile sites on the Cuban island. President Kennedy then did the strategic thing. He asked the leading general what the Russians would do if the U.S. bombed. The general replied that the Russians would do nothing because the U.S. had shown itself to be in the superior position. President Kennedy answered that the Russians had already defended their actions in public. So if we bombed and a number of Russian technicians on the site got killed, Russia would be compelled to strike back. The general was thinking ideologically, but Kennedy was thinking strategically. Too often in recent years, Washington's leaders announce actions against China with no evident regard to how this might result in a counteraction that leaves the U.S. in a worse situation. From a strategic standpoint, neither the Trump nor the Biden administrations asked themselves if trying to put Meng Wanzhou into prison was worth the collateral damage. The U.S. might have lodged charges against Huawei Company and let the case play out in some court without any arrests at all. Then, if the court found against Huawei, the Department of Justice at that time could have had a big press conference and announced victory over the guilty company.
Over the past 3 years, my life has been turned upside down. It was a disruptive time for me as a mother, a wife, and a company executive. But I believe every cloud has a silver lining. It really was an invaluable experience in my life.
Contrast this to Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. People remember the American ambassador to the United Nations, Stevenson, confronting the Soviets about the missiles in Cuba. The UN session was on worldwide TV. Stevenson publicly accused the Russians of deceit because the Americans could then point to blow-up photos of the actual missile sites. The photos were the hard evidence in hand. That's when you can play tough. But in 2021, the U.S. got into trouble with the Canadian judge because it went after Meng Wanzhou before the world without any hard evidence. 3 administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden, all convinced themselves they had good evidence against Huawei's CFO. It took the judge half an hour to pick it all apart. That's what happens when you're guided by your ideology.
CCP is a one-party, totalitarian, political organization committed to a foreign, anti-Chinese ideology.
China's over here. Look at what China's doing. They're learning from China. China, okay?
Look at that. Isn't that nice? China, China, China,
China, China, China, China, China, China, China, China, China, China.